team, incoming! Prepare Bay 1!
Let's get him on the monitor.
The helicopter came down through the darkness like a wounded bird, its blades shaking the windows of St. Mercy Medical Center in coastal Virginia. Rain hammered the helipad, alarms screamed through the emergency department, and nurses ran toward the trauma doors as if the entire night had suddenly caught fire. Then the back doors of the helicopter opened, and 4 heavily armed special operations soldiers jumped out carrying a stretcher between them. One of them was bleeding badly. Another was unconscious. But the soldier in front never looked at the doctors, the surgeons, or even the trauma chief. His eyes searched desperately across the crowded emergency room until they stopped on a woman in plain navy blue scrubs. He pointed toward her and shouted, "Beacon. We need Beacon." For years, people had called her nothing more than a float nurse. That night, everyone was about to learn what those words had really meant. If you believe kindness can change a life, that second chances are real, and that the people we overlook may be carrying more strength than we ever imagine, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the light someone needs in their darkest hour. Her name was Grace Bennett, and at 42 years old, she had become almost invisible inside St. Mercy Medical Center. She was not assigned to one department. She floated wherever the hospital needed another pair of hands. Some weeks she worked in the emergency department, other weeks in intensive care, sometimes pediatrics, sometimes the surgical floor, and sometimes she filled gaps nobody else wanted. She knew nearly every hallway, every supply cabinet, every elevator that moved too slowly, and every alarm that sounded different from the others. But despite knowing the hospital better than most people who had worked there twice as long, Grace rarely received recognition. The younger nurses called her dependable. The administrators called her flexible. The doctors called her when they were short-staffed. But nobody called her extraordinary. Grace had once believed she would become a trauma nurse permanently. Years earlier, she had been one of the brightest students in her nursing program. She had a husband named Thomas, a little boy named Caleb, and a plan for their future. Then one winter morning, everything changed. Thomas died suddenly in a highway accident while driving home from work. Grace was left with a 6-year-old son, a mortgage, and a grief so heavy that some mornings she could barely breathe. She returned to nursing because she had no choice, but she no longer wanted a prestigious position. She wanted stability. She wanted to be home when Caleb came back from school. She wanted to do useful work without having to explain to anyone why she sometimes stared out a window for too long. Over the years, Grace developed a quiet habit of helping people nobody else noticed. She remembered the name of the elderly patient whose family never visited. She brought extra blankets to frightened teenagers. She sat beside dying patients when their relatives were stuck in traffic. She knew which janitor was working a double shift and always left him a cup of coffee. When a new nurse named Rebecca made a mistake and was terrified she would be fired, Grace stayed beside her until the situation was corrected. She never expected anything in return. In fact, she had grown so accustomed to being overlooked that she sometimes joked to herself that floating meant being invisible. That evening, however, something strange happened. Grace was working in the emergency department when the hospital received a call from a nearby military installation. An incoming aircraft was carrying multiple casualties, but the details were classified. The emergency department went into lockdown preparation. Trauma bays were cleared. Blood products were brought downstairs. Surgeons were called from home. Security officers filled the hallways. Nobody knew exactly what was coming, only that it was serious. Grace noticed something the others missed. The trauma room assigned to the incoming patients had a malfunctioning wall monitor. The screen flickered every few seconds, and the backup monitor had been moved to another room. She immediately remembered a portable unit stored in an unused treatment area. She ran to retrieve it, tested the battery, checked the cables, and brought it into the trauma bay just minutes before the helicopter arrived. Then came the sound of the rotors. The first soldier arrived with a penetrating chest injury. The second had severe blood loss. The third had burns across his arms and neck. The fourth was unconscious, his breathing dangerously shallow. Medical teams surrounded them, cutting away uniforms and connecting lines. Grace moved silently between everyone, anticipating needs before anyone asked. She noticed a medic struggling with a damaged four-line and replaced it. She recognized that one patient's oxygen saturation was falling despite the monitor reading something different. She checked the equipment manually and discovered the sensor was faulty. She called for another unit before the problem became fatal. But then the emergency department doors opened again. A second helicopter had landed. This time, the soldiers who entered were different. They were not ordinary military personnel. Their uniforms were unmarked, their faces exhausted, and their movements carried the discipline of people accustomed to operating in places where mistakes could cost lives. One of them was holding a folded piece of paper covered with handwritten medical notes. He looked around the room, searching for someone. Grace was standing near the medication cart. The soldier's eyes locked onto her. He asked for Beacon. For a moment, Grace thought he was talking about a piece of equipment. Then she remembered a name from years earlier. Beacon. It was the call sign given to a civilian medical trainer who had worked with military medics during a disaster response program nearly a decade before. Grace had never told anyone at St. Mercy about it. After Thomas died, she had quietly completed an advanced trauma and disaster medicine program, where she spent several months training alongside military medical teams. Her instructors had called her Beacon because she had an unusual ability to remain calm when everyone else was overwhelmed. She had left that world after her husband's death and returned to ordinary hospital nursing. But the soldier standing before her had remembered. He told the trauma chief that years ago, during a joint emergency exercise in Texas, Beacon had saved a young medic's life by recognizing a hidden tension injury that everyone else had missed. That medic had eventually joined special operations. Now he was lying unconscious on Grace's trauma table. The room suddenly became silent around her. Grace stepped toward the patient. His name was Aaron Collins. He was 29 years old. His blood pressure was dropping. His breathing was unstable. The monitors were screaming. A surgeon began preparing for emergency intervention, but Grace noticed something that reminded her of the old training she had almost forgotten. The man's chest injury was not behaving like a simple trauma case. His oxygen levels were deteriorating in a pattern she had seen before. She pointed toward his chest and urgently explained what she believed was happening. The trauma team acted immediately. Within minutes, the pressure was relieved, his oxygen levels began to rise, and the chaotic room slowly settled. Nobody celebrated. There was still a long road ahead. But Aaron was alive. Grace stepped backward and suddenly realized everyone was looking at her. The trauma chief, Dr. Jonathan Reed, stared at her with disbelief. He had worked with Grace for 6 years and had never known about her military medical training. The young nurse who had once thought Grace was simply an older float nurse watched her with tears in her eyes. Even the special operations team stood quietly nearby. Then the soldier who had asked for Beacon walked toward Grace. He did not salute her because she was not military. Instead, he simply shook her hand. He told her that Aaron had talked about her for years. He said that whenever their team trained new medics, Aaron used to tell them about the civilian nurse who taught him that saving a life was not about being the loudest person in the room. It was about paying attention when everyone else stopped looking. Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes. For years, she had believed that after Thomas died, the best part of her life was behind her. She thought her career had become something she endured rather than something she loved. She thought being a float nurse meant she had failed to become the person she once wanted to be. But standing there under the harsh emergency room lights, she finally understood something. She had not disappeared. She had been everywhere. Every department that needed her had received a little piece of her experience. Every frightened patient she had comforted mattered. Every young nurse she had encouraged mattered. Every late-night decision made quietly and without applause mattered. The next morning, Grace walked into the hospital cafeteria expecting another ordinary day. Instead, she found the hospital staff gathered around a table. There was no ceremony planned. No television cameras. No dramatic announcement. Just a handwritten card signed by nurses, doctors, technicians, and even the cleaning staff. At the top, someone had written, "To Grace Bennett, our beacon." She stared at those words for a long time. Then she smiled. Not because she had finally received recognition, but because she realized she had never actually needed it to make her work meaningful. Months later, Aaron Collins returned to St. Mercy walking without assistance. He had scars on his chest and a long road of rehabilitation ahead, but he was alive. He brought Grace a small wooden plaque engraved with a simple message about being a light in the darkness. Grace placed it beside a photograph of Thomas and Caleb on the shelf in her home. Caleb, now a teenager, looked at the plaque and asked why people called his mother Beacon. Grace smiled and told him that sometimes a person does not realize they are carrying a light until someone lost in the dark finds them. That night, after Caleb went upstairs, Grace stood quietly at the kitchen window. Outside, rain tapped against the glass just as it had on the night the helicopters arrived. She thought about Thomas. She thought about all the patients she had lost, all the ones she had saved, and all the moments when she had wondered whether her life still had a purpose. For the first time in years, she no longer wondered. She understood. Purpose does not always arrive with applause. Sometimes it wears ordinary scrubs. Sometimes it works night shifts. Sometimes it carries coffee for exhausted coworkers and sits beside strangers who are afraid. Sometimes the person everyone calls, just a float nurse, is actually the person holding the whole place together. And sometimes, when the darkest night comes, the world does not need a hero who looks powerful. It needs a beacon. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that their quiet efforts matter, and subscribe so more stories like this can reach people who need hope. And before we end, I want you to do something special. Comment, "Be a beacon," below if you believe that one act of kindness can change someone's life. Because Grace Bennett never became famous. She never appeared on the front page of a newspaper. She never asked anyone to remember her name. She simply kept showing up, kept caring, and kept helping people through the moments when they were most afraid. And perhaps that is what makes her story so powerful. The world may not always notice the people who carry the light. But when the darkness comes,